Welcome to the AlphaMind podcast, the podcast which focuses on the person doing the trading, the trader, and their interaction with the market, the impact the market has on them, and the skills, actions and activities needed to navigate their way through the terrain of the financial markets. Today we are taking a slightly different turn. We have had so many requests from listeners who themselves categorise themselves as traders of regular markets, but who have asked if we could help illuminate the mysterious worlds of DeFi or Decentralised Finance and its main subcomponent, crypto. Some of these people do trade the main cryptocurrencies, but even then many have said they do not possess an in-depth understanding of DeFi and its complexities beyond the surface level. Indeed, we recently polled our followers on Twitter, and we know from surveys that our audience are reasonably sophisticated in terms of market knowledge. But even then, those who admitted to having a reasonably strong understanding of DeFi were less than 20%. Now, we recognise there is an age barrier here, and we feel that the more you are knowledgeable about the market you are baptised into, the harder it is to become open to new developments which are part of the constant evolution of markets, and which always start as new fads, dismissed as such by older participants, but which then gain wider acceptance and then eventually become new trends. Hence, many people, say younger than 30, and perhaps even closer to their mid-20s, for them the world of DeFi, decentralised finance, is their world, and they can talk the language of it, and they understand it. There are some people in their 30s who are clued up about this, but to most DeFi and the world of cryptocurrencies is something of a mystery. And then you get into, well, I would broadly say the over 40s, and for them DeFi is largely an alien world, difficult to navigate, let alone to even comprehend. Now, in this episode of the AlphaMind podcast, my co-host Mark Randell and myself, Stephen Goldstein, who are both far older than is healthy to admit and some way past the wrong side of 50, are facilitating a panel of DeFi and crypto experts who we feel span the ages and bridge the gap between conventional trading and regular financial markets in order to try and help you, our audience, start to make some sort of sense of the DeFi revolution. Now, we don't know how far we managed to achieve this. We do feel we had some success, and we asked a lot of questions which tried to clear up some of our own confusion. And we certainly came away with a little bit more clarity, but I'm also mindful that we probably came away with far more questions as we moved into the mire that really is the early days of decentralised finance. We would like to thank our panel of experts, Glenn Goodman, Paul Gordon and Matt Aaron, for giving up their time to be with us and to provide some fascinating talking points, which hopefully will help you, the audience, gain some greater understanding of this, I suppose you could say, murky world of decentralised finance. Now, before we start, we would like to thank our podcast sponsor, the Society of Technical Analysts, the STA. The STA provide world-beating education on price action analysis techniques and have been the go-to place for pro traders and investors to learn high-level technical analysis skills for over 5 decades. Now, do check out their brilliant home study course, which is based off their technical analysis diploma taught annually at the London School of Economics. Listeners to the AlphaMind podcast can obtain a discount on the STA home study course. To know more about this, visit alpha-mind.net. Now, on with this week's podcast.
Well, welcome to this week's AlphaMind podcast. DeFi, Decentralised Finance, NFTs, cryptos, mining, blockchain, Web 3.0. Frankly, phrases that many of us sort of scratch our heads over and kind of just don't know too much about. And certainly conversations that Steve and I had, we know some surface stuff, but the deep stuff and what's going on and the whys and what are the trends and what are the biases and, you know, where's it moving? Where's it come from? We just do not know the story there. And we just thought it would be so cool to bring together 3 people that have evolved with this space and have created thought leadership in this space. And we have them together today. We have Glenn Goodman, we have Paul Gordon, and we have Matt Aaron. And I want them all to just take a little bit of time, and perhaps starting with Glenn, if you can just introduce yourself. And good for you to be here. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, good to be here. I used to be a TV reporter and presenter for the BBC and for ITV News. I was mainly a business correspondent for many years, so that kind of gave me my intro into trading. Started trading, got into crypto, which was just kind of burgeoning, or Bitcoin was at that time. Hardly any other cryptos even existed, but I started trading Bitcoin, and then as other cryptos came along, I got even more interested in the technology because Ethereum really excited me, the possibilities that went along with that. And of course, we've seen Ethereum develop massively since then, and many, many apps on the back of Ethereum. And then I wrote a book, The Crypto Trader, that Harriman House published in 2019, and last year during the 2021 crypto boom, it became a bestseller. It's an introduction to crypto, but mainly to crypto trading.
Great for you to be on this show. This is just going to be so interesting given your background. And Paul, perhaps just moving on to yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me back. My background prior to falling down the crypto rabbit hole was in derivatives markets. For 20 years, I was a derivatives trader and broker, formerly an open outcry trader in the pits on the live market in the 90s, and then transitioned to spring-based trading once that all closed down. So it was interesting to see that transition in terms of generations of technology, or say technology, from open outcry and trading to new technologies coming in and disrupting markets, but being natural evolutions, etc. So that was, I guess, in terms of when I came across Bitcoin, having seen that process in the past, I guess that's one of the things which sort of grabbed my attention, knowing that markets constantly evolve over time. This, I guess, was looking at something beyond that, and that money also itself evolves over time and itself is a technology. So like many people, when I first came across the subject, I was a little bit confused at first, put the time and effort in to understand it. By early 2012, I was pretty gripped, and my mind was full of all sorts of ideas of business opportunities, commercial opportunities. Trading futures was becoming ever more difficult, especially trading short-term interest rates. So I decided it was time to leave that world behind and throw myself into these new technologies, or start looking more closely at them. I turned up at the first ever Bitcoin meetup in London in a pub in Paddington in September in 2012, where 4 or 5 of us sat around over a few beers discussing and geeking out, talking about Bitcoin. As Glenn mentioned, it was really the only thing you could talk about then in terms of crypto, because that's pretty much all there was. And as we started attracting more members to that pub and we outgrew the pub, it was myself that took it under my wing to start organising more formal networking events, which we did. We renamed ourselves Coinscrum, and for the next 8-9 years, hosted regular monthly events, presenting new ideas and new technologies as they started to come through.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess unlike Paul and Glenn, I am not a professional trader. I've done a number of things. I started out doing a bunch of web dev stuff, and then stuff in the natural food space, and then I kind of got roped into Bitcoin and Ethereum in 2017. Did a variety of things, but a year and a half ago, I got into DeFi analytics and launched an on-chain DAO, a web analytics platform tracking a number of these different DeFi primitives, and have just been heads deep in it. And so I actually kind of became a trader by accident. I was just very interested in crypto, especially the rebellion, to be honest, against the banks. So kind of, I won't say diabolical, but like really, we're not a fan of the banking system and some of its structural issues. Not that there aren't good things about it too. And now I'm doing this full time and trying to keep up with it the best I can, because I think Paul and Glenn can second me that we're at the point now, and we've probably been there for 6 months, where it's literally impossible to keep up with everything going on.
No, very good. Thanks. And I just want to pick on something that Glenn said, actually, and your initial chat there. You said you started off with Bitcoin, but then you said that something excited you about Ethereum to want to switch to trading Ethereum. Now, I guess all these things were the same, but what was it about Ethereum that excited you to want to start trading that?
Well, Ethereum is like a computer operating system in some ways, and people used to call it the world computer a lot. I don't know if people call it that much anymore, but it still kind of is. The point about Ethereum was it has its own programming language. Apps can be built on top of it, or dApps as they're sometimes called. And in fact, actually, almost the entire DeFi financial system, most of it is built on Ethereum, though there are other layer one blockchains that are being used now more and more for DeFi apps. But nonetheless, Ethereum still remains the main player. And it just goes to show there's so much that you could do with Ethereum. But actually, the DeFi industry has developed to such a degree now and sort of taken on a life of its own, as I'm sure Matt will explain in great depth, that while you were talking, it made me think of a question that I have for Paul. Do you mind if I ask Paul a question? Because I didn't realize he used to be a derivatives trader. Here's the thing that worries me the most about DeFi. And I'm going to give you an example of how complicated it is. Right here is a real life message that was sent from one user to another user. I mean, I've just taken this as an example. There are examples like this proliferate everywhere, but this is just one example to give you an idea. He says to the other user, I recommend you buy Phantom, lock it for 2 or 3 months on the F wallet, get around 6% yield on your Phantom. And at the same place, you can mint SFTM equivalent to the amount that you staked. Then you should lock those SFTM as collateral to borrow FUSD. You can get around 33% of your collateral value. Use those FUSD to buy WFTM on FSwap. Once you've got your WFTM, transfer them to Yearn, lock them in their vaults. They give you good APY. Then with the deposit receipt, they'll give you YVFTM. Bring those to Abracadabra, lock them as collateral, take a loan, but don't risk too much. I'll only take 30%. Then bring those to buy Tarot token on Spirit Swap. Go to Tarot and lend your Tarot single-sided for 120%. That's a typical conversation. That's just one bit of the dialogue. It's like, this is how complicated it is. And my question for Paul is, this reminds me a hell of a lot of a book that I read called Traders, Guns and Money by Satyajit Das back in 2006, I think it was, before the great financial crash. And it was warning. He was he worked in derivatives. I think it was derivatives, either trader, salesperson. And he basically was terrified of the complexity that was being created with collateralized mortgage obligations, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps in particular were really scaring him at the time, though as it turned out they weren't the main culprit when the actual crash happened. But you get the idea, Paul. It's like, it's not dissimilar to what I was reading in that book back then. Does that worry you?
Yes, in an answer. There you go. No, it does. I do think, as fascinating as this new world is, that's emerged seemingly out of nowhere over the last few years, yes, there's lots of potential. Yes, it's still very early days. Yes, there's money being made right now, but it does concern me that it's virtually impossible to quantify the risks. And I think we're probably still seeing that in traditional markets as well. I mean, efforts were made after the 2008 crisis, and then standards were probably even then since been brought down in certain areas. But it does concern me. Two things concern me that seem to be conveniently overlooked regularly. We talked about Ethereum. You talked about what was interesting about Ethereum versus Bitcoin is the fact that the idea was that it becomes this world computer. Anyone can permissionlessly come along, decide to write software effectively and to publish that software, and this is trading related software that anyone can interact with. You don't need to onboard with a broker or an exchange or a trading venue. You don't need your traditional custodians or clearing houses. These have all been programmed through code onto these open decentralized networks. So that's a huge innovation, hugely interesting. That's great, but it doesn't come without risks, and we've seen that already. My main concerns, much to my distinct cost way back in 2014 when the ideas around Ethereum were first published, was their argument was that Bitcoin, and we do need to remember Bitcoin is programmable as well. I mean, Bitcoin One of its, the key features, which was promised in its early days, that bringing about this idea of programmable money. Bitcoin has a very, very kind of concise, small scripting language, which has very simple outcomes, and those contracts, if people have heard the term smart contract, especially applied to Ethereum, a smart contract is essentially a snippet of a conditional code. It's not necessarily a snippet, it could be a long piece of code, but it's setting out some conditions which, if this happens, then do this. And a smart contract can act as a digital wallet, so it can hold funds, digital assets on behalf of those interacting with it. So it effectively acts like the escrow agent. And if a certain condition happens, it would decide who to settle with and who to send funds to. So that's essentially what's going on under the hood of DeFi. Now, Ethereum came along and said, Bitcoin is way too limited to program. Development happens at a snail's pace. We want to move quick. We want to be able to do anything possible. So they came along and said, well, our smart contract, our programming language, unlike Bitcoin, will allow you to do anything. That is, if you're writing a program or a piece of software to run on your laptop, which is great in principle. Unfortunately, what that opens up is a huge attack surface. So that means you make one mistake in that smart contract, which lives in the public domain. Any hacker out there can come along and review it, and they do regularly. And from time to time, they're going to find an error in that code, in that smart contract. And that can be compromised and hacked. Last year alone, we saw over $1.5 billion worth of hacks in DeFi. And it's difficult to see how that's going to kind of disappear over time. I think that's a risk that's always going to be there. On top of that, just back to the point about how this compares with traditional markets in the past. We have a whole network of stable coins which are supporting this ecosystem. They could be backed by cash in a bank, operated by a company. Some of them are programmatic stable coins, which are really, they don't actually have a cash backing, they have margin backing. All fascinating, but these all pile risk upon risk, and we don't know where the breakpoints are. So it does concern me that at some point things are going to stop working.
Matt, any thoughts about anything that Glenn put out there?
Yeah, I actually have I have no concern to what they just said. I feel like everything they said, I agree that the challenges of it, but I think that's just going to be solved by free markets. Meaning that, like, here, I'll share my screen right now. So just like in the traditional markets, I assume after 2008, people were taking less risk with like these CDPs. The same thing is happening, and it's eventually going to happen with DeFi, meaning that, like, I know the guys from DeFi Safety, and they do a lot of auditing and check for certain things with these protocols. So the way I look at it is that like balancers never had a hack. Aave had some bugs that have been disclosed, but I think that eventually, I don't think it's going to blow up and go to zero. Like one of the guests said, I think it's more like, okay, people will start to factor in when they see these yields that it doesn't come with the risk. And I think just people will get more mature and learn over time. The only risk I see is maybe it being slowed down by regulators who are trying to protect the interest of the banks.
I quite like what Matt's saying, actually. I have to say, and also Paul's answer to my question as well. What I like about what Matt's saying is when he said free markets will sort it out, and that, is that everybody who's in DeFi either does know or certainly should know that there are enormous risks involved. You don't get ridiculous, yield. You don't get like 100% return on your money anywhere else in the world. As long as it would be nice if regulators in different countries would just, when it comes to DeFi, if they would just smash massive risk warnings. Well, that's all they need to do. Just warn all the ordinary people who are getting involved. This is incredibly risky, and that's why you get such huge yield. Because, well, maybe not even incredibly risky, but it's very risky. You never know when the whole house of cards comes collapsing. But the thing is, right, a couple of weeks ago when we were planning this podcast recording and it was postponed, I was getting ready to say, I'm really worried about the fact that there's this risk and the other risk from DeFi. And one risk in particular that I was worried about a few weeks ago was the one whereby if somebody takes somebody or a group of people take control of a particular protocol, they're able to manipulate the actual code and rewind trades that have already happened. That's one out of many, many ways that, in theory, people can manipulate the market in DeFi. If they take control of the entire protocol, they can undo trades that have already happened and effectively take people's money. But then, since then, I thought of this a few weeks ago. Since then, we've had the London Metal Exchange basically do that in the real world in a regulated environment. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Mark and Steve, you will be the experts on this, so I can't wait to hear your view. But to me, it's just like unbelievably appalling. It's one thing to stop a market when it's getting out of control and say, let's cease trading for a few days. That's something they like to do. And sometimes you could argue that that's a bit dodgy when they do that, and sometimes not. But in this case, they're actually cancelling trades, contracts that existed between buyers and sellers because they want to protect the people who are their members. I think that was the interview I saw. I hope I'm not misquoting him, but the guy in charge of the London Metal Exchange, I think he said, we need an orderly market and to look after our members. I think that was what he said to Bloomberg. And it's like, what do you mean to look after your members? That's not the point. It's supposed to be a free market.
It's interesting because I was waiting to jump in there. Is that right, Mark? Did you have something you wanted to say at all?
No, I'm fine. I'll save it up to the end. Just carry on. I don't want to stop the flow.
I'll be honest, right? I'd love to answer that question, that point there you said, Glenn, but there was something happening to me before that, which I just want to share with the three of you. And it was kind of like dinosaur tunes out. Okay. The conversation was going between the three of you, which really kind of emphasizes a lot of my point with crypto. And part of the reason for this podcast, I'm quite happy to talk about me being a trading Tyrannosaurus Rex. Okay. And I'm sure Mark is probably maybe more of a Brontosaurus. I can see your hands up there, Matt. I'll come back to you in a minute.
Vegetarian dinosaur. Yes.
And that is, I started in the mid-1980s. And I worked with a lot of the dinosaurs in those days who were going like, these derivative things, they're never going to work. I don't get it. I'm not even going to bother going there. Very simple derivatives, things as simple as, the very early basic swaps and FRAs and, even futures. And now I feel a bit like one of those when I hear, and yet in one way it's very different. And in other words, it's the same. Glenn, you made a point there, what the LME did last week. And it almost brings me to that part of the question of this, what the LME did was a clear, for me, demonstration of this is house rules and you're breaking house rules. Okay. We can very go back to everything in trading goes back to almost it being a casino. I know that is a rather disparaging comparison, but it is. You've got the house and you've got the players. The banks historically have been the house. The central banks have been the house. The exchanges have been the house. And the exchanges are there to provide a market, but they also have to look after their members. And they sometimes...
They're not sorry to interrupt, but they're not supposed to favour certain clients over certain others, are they? Surely.
Well, they're not supposed to, but the casinos are not supposed to break your fingers when you suddenly start finding a system that beats them. But they do. Okay. They'll break
that's
play to the rules, but you suddenly find the way around the rules. You'll suddenly be taken downstairs to the car park, and you'll get a warning that might end up with your legs being broken, your fingers being broken, or much worse. Okay,
that's the guy from the LME seemed much posher and nicer than the finger breaking type.
But that's basically what they're doing, right? They're using. We had it's one of my favourite stories, or quite sad stories. The guy who the flash crash. The guy who got the blame for the flash crash.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 2011.
That's an example of the exchanges coming down upon someone else who was beating them. Okay, for me, that was just them turning around and saying, okay, you found a way to beat us, we're changing the rules. And, I don't think he was actually the orchestrator of the flash crash. in the end, but he found a way around beating them. They're temporarily, and they don't like it. And
was he the guy who was doing order spoofing? Is that
yeah.
who I'm thinking of?
Yeah,
that's interesting because we're coming back to DeFi. It's because it's basically a playground for people to invent new kinds of derivatives and new kinds of ways to trade. And it's unregulated. This means that it's open to all the traditional ways of manipulating markets, including order spoofing. And then people have to try and write the smart contracts in such a way that to try and prevent these things from happening. But it's obviously all a bit experimental and all a bit hit and miss. And there's a hell of a lot of traditional, the kind of things Jesse Livermore used to write about going on, that kind of manipulation. Which is worrying, but as I say, you can attempt to get around it by writing the code in such a way.
There's always a house. There's always people that have to make the market, and there's people who they're playing against, who are the players. They're turning up at the casino.
But with DeFi, you don't have the casino owners in some cases. I mean, sometimes. I mean, Matt, you know more about this than anyone else, but some protocols are more centralized than others, right? Some of them are more controlled by their software developers, and some of them, like Uniswap, are almost uncontrolled. Well, almost uncontrolled, I suppose, or relatively speaking. Like there's a distinct lack of middlemen in some of these, like Uniswap.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I just want to say, and I appreciate your point there, Glenn. I'll address that second. But first, Steve, we definitely do not want to start speaking in concepts that can get the reader lost, because that's when they put down their podcast and do something else. We want to make sure people listen to this. So I think perhaps I'd suggest that we start using metaphors, because that helped me a lot, because I'm still learning about all this stuff. Like you can never learn all this stuff. So I think like a great metaphor is you talked about like systemic risk. Let's think of it this way. Let's pretend like you have the Chicago like Commodities Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange. Everyone listening knows that. We could almost pretend like each blockchain is a different one of these exchanges, and they're all experimenting with these new, more open and more democratic. At the same time, it's hyper capitalist, and that like code is law. So if you can figure out ways to manipulate things, you can do that. There's no insider trading rules, so it's very like hyper capitalist. But the great thing about this, like this is here to stay. But maybe let's say Ethereum, if it were the London Stock Exchange, or maybe Solana is the Myanmar Stock Exchange. One of these exchanges, aka blockchains, could die in this development. And so I thought that might be a not horrible metaphor to like maybe kind of frame these things.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, an exchange is almost, I suppose you could say in a way, a cryptocurrency, or I don't even know if that's the right phrase.
Yeah, because it's like
currency distorts everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, unless you're like a 190 IQ genius. I mean, I don't think anyone that's not familiar with DeFi can listen to one podcast and like understand how it works. So I think it's the goal of like getting these metaphors. I think it might be the easiest way, like the storytelling, to like at least get people interested, and then we can send like perhaps like additional reading if people want to go further down the proverbial rabbit hole. Yeah.
And that's why it's interesting getting sort of three individuals who have had, I think Mark used the term, an evolution into this. So you come in as Matt, as someone who almost went straight into this world. Paul, you've come from the professional world and have been on that side. You've worked in the exchanges, you worked for the bank, you worked for the house, and you've been the player trying to take on the house.
Yeah, I guess so. Look, there are similarities, and I think evolution is the correct word to use. And we, as I said, we're still in the very early days. We've got to always say to people, you have to remember, because everyone, like the regulators, are often mostly seen as the bad guys. And look, some of them, are questionable in terms of their understanding and their knowledge, especially with new markets, new technologies, when they start coming in and trying to kind of apply rules over things that they're not really too well versed in. So that's always going to be a challenge. But also, I think Glenn mentioned Jesse Livermore and stories from 100 years ago. None of these are new problems. Markets are driven by humans at the end of the day. Most humans act honestly or want to act honestly, but there's always some that don't, and they'll see an opportunity to take advantage, to scam others. And it's no different in any markets. And the reasons we've got such heavy regulation is because those bad actors have always been there, and regulators have had to step in to try and protect everyone else and create orderly markets. And the exchanges, when they were mostly membership based and didn't have, outside shareholders to try and create profits for, again, that was a big change in my mind. That dynamic was a huge change, which meant that exchanges might have, where they might have been there to independently maintain order and nothing else. Once they had a profit motive in place and shareholders to answer to, then they maybe started compromising some of their own rules and their own motives for their own profit. And I think that was a big problem. But look, we've seen all these changes. If this new industry can also bring about the protections for the majority of people using these systems, and I'm not saying they can't over time, but people will always try and cheat. And ultimately, if a lot of retail, especially retail traders, are constantly being cheated, that's when regulators get more upset. They come in and start trying to apply rules, as I said, often in a manner which isn't fit for the actual technology. So I think these are the things that we need to think about and be careful about. And we are seeing certain regulators doing a better job at engaging with the industry, allowing the innovation to happen, but making it clear where the lines are, and the lines are drawn to make sure things don't get out of hand. So I think we're just at that stage now. And I think hopefully, the industry, if it applies this technology as it can be, even if certain things haven't necessarily been developed yet, over time, we can end up with a much better system than we currently do have, and a fairer system. But it's for the industry to prove that it can do that.
But it's interesting. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say it's interesting what Paul's saying there, because of course everything kind of goes in cycles over time, over history, and actually, ironically, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular, are a direct result of the regulatory capture that happened in the traditional finance industry, the traditional banking. So you had a crazy world, the Jesse Livermore world, with bucket shops where people would trade and all the rest of it, and lots of all kinds of shenanigans going on. And then you get massive regulation coming in, which works to a certain degree for decades and decades. But then you get to a situation where the regulators are arguably, to some degree, in some countries, in the pockets of certain industry players like the big banks, and they're too much kind of in league with them. And so you get a situation like 2008 where the whole thing collapses, and it's the banks that get saved and the ordinary people who get shafted, and everybody gets really angry. And then Satoshi Nakamoto invents Bitcoin directly because he's so angry about that and about that regulatory capture. And then you get the entire DeFi industry growing out of that, like we have now, which is, it's back to the kind of Wild West days in terms of finance, in terms of coming up with unique products, and in terms of ordinary people getting scammed sometimes because they're trusting anonymous individuals who invent these protocols. Quite often they're anonymous. You don't even know who they are. And you get, Matt will be very familiar with the term rug pull, because you get these in the world of DeFi where somebody sets up a new protocol, a new system, gets people, or not even in even in traditional crypto, I should call it. But, you get this where somebody sets something up, sets up a new thing, asks for investors, asks for people to lend their money. People pour in tons of money, and then the guy steals the money. And everyone goes, I can't believe they stole the money. And you go, but you didn't even know who the guy was. Like, of course they stole your money. Like, why wouldn't they? They're an anonymous person. They're clearly, that's the thing, is people can't tell. It's impossible to tell the difference these days between thieves and people who want to stay anonymous because they like their privacy and they're just a little bit shy. That's kind of the split that you have, because some of the most useful people in the world of crypto and DeFi are just very shy private people who hide behind avatars. But then some of them are thieves, and quite often it's impossible to tell which one's which until it's too late.
Tread with some care there, crumbs. I think if you look back into the way financial markets evolved, the things that were clearly wrong, and I think, from having been a pit trader myself, market supervision just didn't have a clue what it was, what it was looking at. When you had an out trade on the floor, it was a case of pot luck whether they were going to be on your side or whatever. But actually going through time, through the banking challenges, they never really ever got it right, and these were people, they started to get it right when when you started to see people that were heads of trading start to become market supervisors. So you start to get people that have actually done it. But people that have just been put there as almost like there's your job, you've got to supervise this stuff going on. And I think I get a sense that crypto might be kind of in that space. The exchanges are trying to put some degree of shape around it, but of course they are answerable to the members and the risk of all the collective margin they have. So I think one of the biggest challenges the exchanges have, how they actually keep track of a fully marginalized market when you've got 12, 15% daily price moves, and then intraday margin calls and things like that. When we used to trade, you saw stock markets doing 3 to 5% on a daily basis, and you thought that was a lot. You thought that was a hell of a lot if it went day after day. Now you're seeing in this world, 15% up one day, 12% down the next, 8% up the next day. And I guess the question is, how on earth do you regulate that? I mean, because regulation, how do you put control around that? Very difficult.
Yeah, Can I add or go ahead, Paul. Go ahead, sorry.
No. Please go ahead, Matt.
Okay, so I just said a couple of things. So one, here's a very relevant fact. The last time SEC made a ruling, I may be getting the term wrong, but like an actual ruling or a rule for cryptocurrencies was either 2013 or 2014. But the point was, it was before Ethereum and DeFi were even invented. And it is an incredibly difficult task for the regulator. I just want to acknowledge that. It's so complex. And so it's a very hard thing for them to get right. And with Mark adding the context that they've never really got it right for traditional financial markets, which I think I'm the only person here without a background, I find pretty complex as well. I don't think it's that easy for the everyday person to understand immediately, like how these different like straddle options and things like that work. So I would argue, I guess I just put this in the chat, and I can't say it will happen, but I would argue that there could be self-regulation. There are going to be scams, there's going to be rip-offs, what happen in any market, but I do think this is the best chance for a financial market to self-regulate based on its design. Yeah, and I'd actually follow on from that as well, just to the point I was going to make, is that, yes, look, as an experienced trader many years ago on trading on exchanges like Life and CME, yes, and those exchanges generally self-regulating organizations, they're SROs. So, but there was often question marks over how they would, regulating exactly. Many times trades got busted. We discussed that earlier about Nichols trades being busted last week. That happened regularly, and if you made a complaint to the exchange, they follow it through, but they were under no obligation to publish any of the results or come back to you and give you any feedback. Always very questionable. But at the same time, exchanges, ETNs would publish their rule books, which was useful. Then all users of that exchange would at least know what the rules are up front. And at least there would be a method for at least challenging if it looked like those rules have been compromised. Now, the one of the key features of these decentralized networks is complete transparency of information. Everyone, whoever you are, has full visibility of everything that's going on that network and everything that has happened on that network. Now, that is unique to these markets. Now, it is a Wild West, but then that can also hopefully be used to everyone's benefit going forward. Because once we've built systems which do meet a happy compromise of, allaying fears that regulators might have in terms of mostly around KYC and AML perhaps, who are the counterparties to these trades, because at present you can join one of these networks, a decentralized exchange, no onboarding process, you can transact with anyone, you have no idea who they are. That's clearly why regulators are somewhat concerned. But some of these platforms are building modules and components that if you want to reveal your identity to your counterparties, you can. So that's already progress being made. Now, essentially, the rule book of these decentralized exchanges, A, is in the code if you have the capacity to go and unpick that code. B, we can go a step beyond that and effectively publish these rule books for the common man to use, to understand. And to understand what the risks are, what can and can't be done by the code itself. I think Matt mentioned code is law earlier. I'll take slight exception there in terms of just because, just for new people coming to this, terms like smart contracts, saying things like code is law,
I think these things have been discussed over time, and code is code. And this is, I think, when people put too much emphasis on these decentralized networks, the rule of law still exists, which is what we're seeing. And that's why we're seeing certain things challenged within the industry, because regulators still have the rule of law behind them. So we can't just dismiss the rule of law. And even how, if you're coding anything, however much you think you've thought of every scenario, quite often there's still going to be an element of objectivity or subjectivity when it comes to some level of dispute. And you're never going to do away with that. So there's always going to be the need for some net mechanism where someone's going to feel aggrieved and want someone to turn to at some point. But again, as long as the industry is aware of what those challenges are and can work towards coming up with solutions, which, as I said, are probably better than what we have now. And just so I don't ramble on too much, but look, I think we mentioned KYC and AML. It's absolutely ridiculous that today, every broker you on board with, every bank you on board with, every exchange you on board with, you've got to send your passport, send it over email, a copy of your passport, your proof of address. All of this information, which you shouldn't just be throwing out into the public domain, is ridiculous. And it's so inefficient because every bank, every mortgage application you make, you have to upload the information. Why isn't there just one source of this information which you can give permission to share to the person or with the company you want to? Now, this industry is in the early stages of developing technology which will vastly improve that. So over time, when the regulators come to the industry saying, well, you can't carry on in business because you're not doing this, the positive outcome of all of this is the industry will turn around and saying, actually, we can do exactly that, and we can do it in a way which offers more privacy to the end user than we currently have, and means that the centralized bodies, organizations such as the exchanges, which, they're regulating themselves, they have all this information, who are they who are they favoring with that information? Hopefully we can do away with all of that, and we do end up with much fairer markets.
We will return to the podcast shortly. Just a quick reminder that listeners of the AlphaMind podcast can obtain a discount on the STA's outstanding technical analysis home study course. Visit alpha-mind.net to find out more about this offer. Now back to the podcast. Gentlemen, can I ask you a question? Because there's something which it's not backing me, but it's in my mind, and I think a lot of people are asking that. What is the purpose of DeFi? Not what problem is it trying to solve, because I often think that's misleading. What is it trying to be a better version of? In the same way that the mobile phone was a better version of the phone, and then the smartphone was the better version of the mobile phone. Now, it's a very simple analogy, but I don't think the iPhone, when it came along, was necessarily solving a problem, but it was making what is out there much, much better. And we know, it's so much better than just the old Nokia phone or even the BlackBerry. So
I've got an answer to that. I'll try anyway. Basically, when I was a TV reporter, many years ago, I can't even remember what year, maybe it was around about 2008 or something like that, I went and did a TV report with a new innovative firm called Zopa. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're still around. And they were doing this new crazy thing called peer-to-peer lending that had never been done before legally. And it was fascinating. I loved their platform. And you could get, a much better yield than you could get in the bank. But obviously there was risk involved because they were facilitating ordinary people lending to other ordinary people. And they had software which obviously worked out the credit risk of each person who was borrowing money. And so you could kind of choose the risk level that you wanted to have. You could get like 5% a year or 7% a year or 9% a year. And actually, as far as I know, I mean, because I was expecting there to be tons of loans defaulting, but as it turned out, their software worked pretty well. As I recall, they for many years there were just not huge amounts of defaults, even during the great financial crash, as far as I can remember. And so what DeFi is doing is not dissimilar to that. I don't know, what do you think, Matt and Paul? Does it sound similar to that?
Matt, I'm happy to jump in, or if you want to go.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, yes, it does. It is. I think that the term peer-to-peer, so person-to-person, is a good one. And in essence, what that's doing is cutting out a whole swathe of middlemen. Whether rightly or wrongly, I guess time will, give us that answer. But the assumption of people, developing and using these technologies is that there's a lot of middlemen involved in trade of any type. For secure trade, if we just take an FX trade, for example, or a securities trade, you've got a bunch of intermediaries, heavily regulated, heavily capitalized, to ensure the safe pre-trade checks, execution, and settlement of two assets. And the idea with this technology is that we can cut out those middlemen. Now, in the past, the assumption has been that you bring about a lot of efficiencies if you're able to cut out a bunch of rent seekers. There's always and there's a lot of rent seekers in the chain of a typical trade and settlement. Now, with these technologies, the idea is that a large number of those functions, essentially, in future, if people do want a more compliant KYC version of these, you might still have an on-ramp as a broker or a bank that does those KYC checks to let you use part of these networks. But for now, you don't need that permission. As it is, all of those functions of clearing, of broker, of exchange are all wrapped up in a few lines of, or possibly quite a few lines of code, where a person sitting in Japan now and a person sitting in London can effectively agree and execute and settle a trade in a matter of seconds. There's no T+1, T+2. There's no, batch settlement at the end of each day or in 2 days' time between two different clearing houses or what have you. It all happens virtually in real time, much quicker, much more efficient. Now, look, there's trade-offs in all of this as well, which we'll maybe come on to later. There will be a question about, the cost of using these networks is sometimes high. But again, that's a known problem, and there's, solutions being worked on. So again, early days, it doesn't mean that will remain a, stumbling block for in the long term. But, in essence, it is that ability to cut out a whole swathe of middlemen to trade assets person to person or company to company. And if you think once that is, successfully wired and efficiently wired, and regulators are happy with how, new systems that and checks and balances that are put in place to, allay their fears, then, the idea that this is open and permissionless, that a young startup or a multi-billion-dollar company can come and plug into and utilize these networks without anyone's permission. When I was a derivatives trader, I had to put a minimum of 25K capital or collateral down to start trading. I needed to register with the CME and had all of these hurdles to jump through. Unless you were able to do that and participate in maybe some market making schemes that they were offered to provide liquidity and benefit from those, not every Joe can just come along and do that. With these markets, if I've got $500, $1,000, and I want to allocate that to market making across DeFi markets and generate some revenue and income from that, I don't need any permission to do it. And I only need $500 or $1,000 to get going. So that's where it becomes a lot more democratizing and open.
Yeah, it's basically the Financial Conduct Authority's worst nightmare, really. It's just freedom for individuals to choose what risks they want to take, as opposed to which risks the regulator thinks it's sensible for individuals to be allowed to take, and which ones they think you have to be a professional trader to take. Just to give you a quick example, Binance, the world's largest crypto exchange, has folded. They've kind of capitulated to the regulators, particularly the British regulator, the FCA, who are putting a lot of pressure on them about KYC, AML. In the UK, we have a ban on cryptocurrency derivative trading for retail traders. Only professional traders are allowed to do it. And so Binance has gone along with that, and they've put in such strict rules now that I think you have to, when I looked, you had to have more than £5 million in your trading account in order to qualify to trade derivatives. Otherwise, you're considered not a big shot enough to be allowed to do it full stop. As a UK citizen, that is. People from the rest of the world are still allowed to do it, as far as I can tell. Apart
US
from
has never had
American.
access. Yeah,
That's true. Yeah, American.
Well, I'd like to add to that, and really good points there, Paul. And I'd maybe tell a story related to that. I think so. Yeah, you guys mentioned just less middlemen, cutting out middlemen, having more control over your money. And there's many stories of people losing access to their accounts. I know like crypto founders from Canada, from UK, that have been unable to get a house just because they work in cryptocurrency. They pay their taxes, they do everything, but they're seen as a risk. So it kind of adds to that. But I've witnessed firsthand when I first got into Bitcoin, web developers or a graphic designer and a backend developer in Venezuela who were able to escape to Panama and Atlanta respectively. And, that was the only financial access they had because they were able to, travel across borders, not like with literally gold in the backpack, which have been confiscated at airport security or crossing the border into Colombia. And I think that, those are interesting stories. Not everyone it applies to, but as you see in a pretty wild world, it doesn't matter until it does. And Paul mentioned KYC. And I guess my issue with KYC is I don't find it very effective. I think there's a lot of stats on banking. They don't really they lower maybe 0.2% of illicit activity. It's an extremely low amount. And what I see all the time on some of these projects, like Glenn was saying, is the issue with KYC is usually you have to follow US sanctions. And then it's so the really talented the Venezuelan web developer or the person that wants to invest a little bit of their savings in Iran, they end up not having access to the protocols. So there are some big trade-offs made by the accredited investor, which in the US, I think you have to have a couple $1 million to be able to invest. So let's just assume that the goal of KYC is to prevent illicit activity. It ends up having a lot of casualties. So it then becomes a fine line. Is this really decentralized finance? And I don't have the answer there. I just want to show that these are just like in outside of this, there's always very tricky decisions that have to be made that will really shape the way this whole thing grows.
Okay, just for anyone listening there, I'm just checking with you guys. I understand KYC as know your customer.
I actually had assumed that traders would know that, but I maybe that's just my lack of awareness. But yeah, know your customer. So I just think a lot of KYC and ML, just taking a selfie with your passport and just giving them all your documentations and whether you're allowed or not to participate. So a lot of these DeFi protocols, they may say on their website, people from Montreal, people from Quebec, where I used to live, are not allowed to participate sometimes because the government does that. People from Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, China, US. They do that because of this. I'm speaking a little bit, this is not my expertise, but basically they don't want to violate these KYC or AML, which is anti-money laundering rules, because they could get in trouble for that.
Yeah. Given these, these challenges, and with DeFi itself, do you think there's another evolution of DeFi that's yet to happen, sort of like a hybrid version of it that's got and what strikes me is that the financial markets got their act together when, say, KYC and the supervisory stuff went through the middlemen. So the middlemen were part of the sort of the radar. And if DeFi is a world where the middleman is kind of not a man, right? It's kind of, there's a whole bunch of bots and code stuff going on. But is it a case that for it to sort of just exist in a sort of more sustainable way, does it need to evolve from where it is at the moment? Because it does feel like the Wild West still.
Well, the US regulators are hovering in a big way. You might have read last week, or maybe you didn't, because there's a lot of other news going on at the moment. But last week, Joe Biden signed an executive order to basically send a message to all his regulators. And I didn't realize, I knew there were about 10 different financial regulators, but when I saw the list, I think it's even longer than that. It's like so many different bodies, and they're all going to be investigating and writing reports on crypto and DeFi and stuff, and also the development of the central bank digital currency, the digital dollar. They're going to be writing tons of reports, which he wants back in between 3 to 6 months, and then they can start deciding what kind of regulation to bring in. But certainly as far as DeFi is concerned, there are really tricky areas concerned with as you say, Mark, the lack of human beings in some of these projects. And Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, has already kind of scoffed at that, saying, you know, I don't buy this idea that nobody's in charge of some of these things. You know, there's always a human being there somewhere. So words to that effect. He's, you know, they want to kind of out all the people who they think are middlemen, who are just hiding, and they want, really, the fear is that they'll bring in regulations that make these people responsible in ways that they're not really responsible, because in some cases they're just a software developer who just came up with an idea and wrote the code and then sodded off again. You know, sometimes these people they're not even involved after that stage. But if they start thinking that the SEC is going to come and sue them and drag them through the courts just because they wrote a bit of code, then that's going to obviously be a certain, not a moral hazard, what do you call it? A chilling effect. It's going to stifle the innovation. And so it's a really delicate balance that needs to be struck by these regulators. And as Paul was saying earlier, they probably don't really understand half of what they're doing anyway with DeFi and so on. So all we can hope is that the people who write these reports over the next few months start doing some serious research and get a grip on what DeFi is really about before they write out their regulations.
Well, actually, you've taken us full circle to exactly why we're here doing this podcast, because, you know, there is just a lack of understanding that it's a completely different paradigm. It's not, you know, it's so hard to translate. I think, you know, Matt tried to introduce the idea of using some metaphors and analogies so that myself, Mark, and anyone out there who's probably, with the exception of Paul and Glenn, over 30, would understand this. But, you know, it reminds me, when I go back to when I first started working in the city as a trader, and I think I was 24, and my boss came up to me at the bank, the head of trading, and said, Steve, there's these things called swaps, which none of us get, but apparently you can make money doing it. If you can work out how they work, right, go out and make money. And then I went overnight, looked at it, called a friend who was a swaps broker, said, meet me in the pub, explain this to me. He was only too happy to, because he needed a new client. And boom, the next day I said, yeah, I think I've worked it out. And that was it. And we were away. And then, of course, you had to go through all the, you know, the accountants and the risk managers, for what there was in those days, which wasn't a lot. And the compliance, which, again, there wasn't much of either, would come down and say, what's this you're doing? And you try and explain it to them. And they didn't get it at all, but they'd go away and pretend they did. They'd nod politely. And, you know, and often problems, all sorts of problems started from that. But it was just that they couldn't get their head around something, which to me was really simple. But being young and, you know, and actually having hair in those days, and, you know, and I'm afraid, Matt, that's coming your way at some point. But, you know, and I see the same thing here going on. And it's almost like it doesn't work fully with metaphors. The problem with every metaphor is they're so imperfect. Every analogy is always an imperfect representation that you're trying to give. And the reason you're giving it is because it's usually so hard to make a simple explanation of. And I think, you know, that's what I really see with you know, and it's developed its own language, you know, which, you know, when people talk about, you know, for me, I always try to equate it to a currency, which is not really a currency, or even an asset, but it's not really an asset either, is it? It kind of eludes both of those in some way.
You know, without having to delve too deep into the technicalities of Bitcoin and other blockchain networks, you know, Bitcoin did bring along a concept and an idea which was completely unique and groundbreaking in terms of the way that value can be documented, transferred across the world, across these networks. Now, that in its own is a really powerful concept. It's so unique. It is undoubtedly going to remain and embed itself into the internet in the years to come. But, you know, the internet was invented in 1971, I believe, the first version of it. So even by 1981, 10 years in, you know, it was only just then developing certain additional protocols which would allow Tim Berners-Lee to eventually invent the web. So we're only 10, 12 years into Bitcoin. You know, I think there's a certain element. I know it's like, well, just trust the guys building it, because that's you can't trust everyone building it. There's going to be mistakes made along the way. There's going to be successes. There's going to be failures. But the concept of this ability to transfer and record and document a record of value being transferred across the world over the internet without the needs of a bank's network or another bank's network or a clearinghouse's network, all on a standard network, is very powerful. And I think that idea itself is enough to keep everyone captured, especially people building ideas on these networks. It will continue to evolve. There's going to be ideas, there's going to be business models that haven't even been thought about yet, completely new, that some kid will come up with in his bedroom as a 16-year-old and be a billionaire by the time he's 21. But that's the most amazing thing about this is the permissionless nature, where anyone can come in with an idea and put it out there for people to use. Hopefully not with the idea of scamming people, but it's a huge sandpit of experimentation at the moment.
Yeah, Paul is completely right. It's still very early days, but I feel a bit guilty now because we're near the end of the podcast and we haven't. I feel like right at the beginning we should have given you an example of how this thing, just a little pretend example of how it works. So I'm going to do that now to try and just make it clear. A typical thing you do in DeFi, a typical transaction might be. I'm going to simplify it. So I'm going to have to simplify it. A person goes in, right? They've got their money. They've got some collateral, basically, some financial collateral. This wouldn't be their house. This would be a cryptocurrency that they own, right? They already own some cryptocurrency of some kind, right? And they want to borrow some money. So they post this cryptocurrency as collateral, and that allows them to then borrow from another human being somewhere in the world who they can't see and probably will never know as a human being, but they can borrow some money from that person. And the reason they can borrow that money is in many cases because they've over collateralized. They've given more, a lot of money into the pot, and then they get less money borrowed while that money that collateral they've already got just sits there for the duration of the loan. Right. And if they don't pay back the loan, then the collateral gets seized by the person that they borrowed from. And all of this happens automatically through the smart contracts that Paul was referring to earlier, the code that has been written by some random software developer somewhere, and he posted it on the net and set up this protocol. And then the protocol is just rules that are followed. And automatically, if that person doesn't pay back on time, then automatically the collateral goes to the lender. It's as simple as that. Matt, does that work for you, that description?
Yeah, 100%. And so I think I showed something similar to that to Steve last week. I think that in general, a lot of the systems like the Swift system and they're just old systems, old software, right, that are running like traditional financial systems. So it's superior software, built in the modern era that is going to, I think, eat a large share of the traditional finance's lunch. Maybe not everything. And I don't want to say that there are there are certain things in banking that are right now definitely superior to DeFi. I don't want to come across as apologist for DeFi. It does stink. I've been scammed myself and a lot of other retail. I'm also a retail user. I mean, I work in analytics, but I'm not a professional trader. I'm a retail trader. The scams are unfortunate. It can cause a lot of, but I think it also happens in professional, but I think that to sum that all up, yeah, I think this is, again, we can still get away with saying, hey, it's early, it's a bit messy, but this system is going to be a force for years to come.
So if I'm a retail trader looking to do crypto, we know our audience is vast for this, but there's some people out there thinking, well, what do I need to keep an eye out on though? So I've got these risks that I'm now not too sure I've really quantified what these mean to me. What are the signs that something bad might be happening? I mean, how do they know that? Is it invisible? So they just look the next day and everything's gone? Are there any signs? Are there any players they need to avoid? Any things they need to avoid doing to give themselves more protection?
Well, the anonymity isn't great. That's a warning sign in itself. If the person who's set up a project just calls themselves DeFi boy or whatever, it's crypto king, then it's that's a warning, obviously, because you don't know. I mean, it's, I guess, as Paul said, if you can understand the code of the smart contracts, then that helps a hell of a lot. That gives you a certain amount of protection. But, not many people can read that code and understand it well enough. So I don't know. What do you look out for, Matt, apart from anonymity? I had a list somewhere of things that I check off when I do these things. I should dig it out. But what do you look for, Matt?
Yeah. So one, if there are, just to be fair, there are some, Satoshi Nakamoto, who invented Bitcoin, was anonymous, right? Everyone says that, but there are the Yearn, there are a couple protocols that do have anonymous devs that do it for their own safety. But yeah, it's almost like, what are some things that are going, to get this percentage return or whatever that are increase my risk? I'd say one, definitely being anonymous. Two, if the code's been audited, but that's no guarantee, but audits on code. Three, the great thing about these DeFi projects is you can literally, I can't go speak to the head of Goldman Sachs. It's not the best example, but you know what I mean? But the person running the Vanguard mutual fund, I can't just go online and DM that person and say, hey, I own $1,000 worth of your money market Asian Tiger fund. How's it going? What are you doing? And I realize there's rules around that. You can literally speak to them. You can find them interviewed on podcasts. And so just the same things of human nature. If they're not anonymous, find their background. If, for example, if, just to see their work history, things like that. I think getting into the people behind the protocol is number one. And I also think that this is the DeFi safety thing I mentioned. Just for example, when you buy food at the grocery store, is it safe to eat? There are some pretty good quality control, better in some countries than others, but I think UK is pretty good at that stuff. Is this milk safe to drink? There's certain, logos. Not that there's not corruption there. I think that type of stuff will develop, because it's not fair to say you have to learn how to audit smart contracts, which very few people really know how to do, in order to participate, right? That's a huge barrier to entry.
Yeah, well, I guess you talked about the thing about understanding if milk was safe to drink. The UK has decided to remove all its sell-by dates on milk, and you're now told to smell it. So to see whether
is that true?
To see whether it's
that's a bad example then.
So, apply that to crypto.
I think one
smell it.
Look, there are one of the things for me, like in in the old world, trust takes time to build. There's brands which are building trust because they've been around the longest. They've been transparent. They've been open, even if there's been compromises to their code. Their leadership team is very public all the time. And you're going to have these issues. So I think anyone entering this space from scratch, really should take some time to follow and to ask questions, maybe join some chat groups, but at least follow the reputable media outlets to kind of start educating yourself. What are who are the dominant players in this ecosystem? And yes, there might be some tempting opportunities if you're going a little bit further afield or further from center with the known trusted brands. Maybe leave that to a later time and just experiment with what you've kind of discovered are the most trusted brands. For example, we've mentioned Uniswap. Uniswap is a long-established decentralized exchange. No one here can say there is no flaws in their code, which won't be compromised and create risks in the future, but they're a legitimate project. Their development team's very open, transparent, etc. So they built their trust over time, just like brands build their trust in other markets as well. So I think that's always the good place to start and experiment very small. I mean, the good things about these markets is you don't need to kind of throw the kitchen sink at it and remortgage your house to start experimenting. Just start experimenting very small till you understand how they work, how you manage your funds, how you manage your wallets, etc. But look, it's well known within the industry. The user experience from any of these things is still relatively complicated, and that's something that needs to be addressed over time. Believe me, compared to 8, 9, 10 years ago, advances have definitely been made, but there's more to come. But we'll see that again over time.
But it just goes to show how new all of this is, that even Uniswap, which Paul mentioned there as, it's one of the kind of granddaddies of DeFi. It was invented at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And that's like the dawn of DeFi. Okay, there were precursors to DeFi, but that was one of the first big ones. And it's so recent, it's unbelievable.
Two quick things. So sorry, Steve. I think this will really add color here. So one is I do want to. I think we kind of made it seem as if like the majority of money was lost to scams in crypto, but actually I'd say the majority dollar amount is actually not lost by scam, but well-intentioned founders doing very risky things that are just very smart, and then someone exploited. So it was someone else that was anonymously scamming them than the founders themselves. Just so we don't give like a bad. Accidental bad taste in the industry. Then two, one of the big trade-offs with decentralization is this is much less computing power. It's very slow, not very powerful. It has to be across many computers, so it's just slow and not nearly as fast as a centralized system like NASDAQ. So I just want to add that.
Thank you. I guess where I was going was, again, I wanted to say thank you for staying on a bit longer. I get a feeling we could talk for hours. I got one question which I wanted to ask you. And that's how do you value crypto? I suppose it's the ultimate question. You can value a company by its future cash flows. And I know I'm not talking about short term. Short term is supply and demand, but long term, I think Benjamin Graham's quote: in the short term, it's everything's a voting machine. In the long term, it's a weighing machine. And every company valuation is some estimate of its future cash flow potential. At the same time, you can value a bond based on, the central bank rate, the cost of funding, the borrowing behind a bond, and maybe the creditworthiness of the issuer. So there's a clear structure for valuing something. And then you've got supply and demand as different people estimate those values that move it up and down out of that range. How do is a Bitcoin in a year's time, is it worth 10,000? Is it worth 100,000, or the same for Ethereum?
The way I explain it to people who ask me in, conferences and seminars and that kind of thing when I'm speaking, they always ask that question. Of course, it's such an important question. I wrote a whole couple of chapters on fundamentals in my book, and at the end of the chapters kind of said, but all these fundamental valuation methods are pretty sketchy, to be perfectly honest. They're all nice attempts to try and put fundamental valuations on, but it's very difficult. So the way I explain it is, it's kind of like being a dragon in Dragon's Den. Right, we're talking about very early stage tech companies. Well, they're not always companies, obviously, but it's a metaphor. The metaphor is early stage tech companies. How on earth do you put a future valuation on something that could turn out to be the biggest thing in the world, but at the moment is just a one-man band? And that's the case for most cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin, obviously, a bit different now because it's so huge and it's got so much institutional investment in it. And you could say the same to some degree with Ethereum, but pretty much every other cryptocurrency is a kind of long-term bet on a very clever thing having been invented, and hopefully it will go ballistic in the distant future.
So it's optionality, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And at some point, that optionality becomes a non-option play. It becomes an asset with a value.
Yep.
Value.
That's a good description. I like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant. I think there's a certain amount of relative value being kind of apportioned. If we take Bitcoin and its kind of sales pitch of being the digital version of gold and having many qualities similar to gold, many better, some not quite as good. People are often looking at like the total kind of market valuation of all the gold in the world, and what percentage of that Bitcoin's eaten into gold. Do they live side by side in the future? Does one assert the other, or does Bitcoin assert gold? No one knows, but I think you should look at those relative values between those two. And then with everything else, Ethereum was the first and the market leader for the smart contracting programmable networks, which they do have their own currency like Bitcoin, but the currency's there to perform these other additional functions, like building DeFi platforms. Then Ethereum just took the lead. It's not necessarily the best technology, but it got the lead. It got the network effect. It really captured a wide number of developers to build systems on it. So it got its lead. It's kind of maintaining its foothold. Now, everything else that people might have heard of, which are basically trying to be Ethereum competitors, such as maybe Cardano, Tezos, Avalanche, Solana, all these things I think you look at in relative terms to Ethereum. So, what market share are they starting to obtain over Ethereum? If it looks like they're being widely adopted, so you've got to look at how they're being used, what's being built on them, how they're being adopted, and whether that means they have the potential to usurp Ethereum. I think that's the simplest way to look at some of the better known tokens and networks.
It's incredibly interesting. I know that but back in the old days of normal markets, let's call them, you'd normally be reading a report about what happened yesterday and the reason why is why it went up, why it went down, the central bank and flows and whatnot.
That's what I did. That was my job to write that.
There you go. And I think is it possible to write a market report about what's happened in Ethereum today? Why did it go up? Why did it go down? Those types of things.
Yeah, but usually we were making that stuff up anyway. Remember? Again, I wrote about that. Why is it?
It's a career, right?
The market got up when inflation went down, and I'm like,
more buyers than sellers.
Yeah, I mean, that's about the only answer you've got, right? At the moment, well, it's kind of the way it went. 15% later. I guess a lot of this is, you teach your 13-year-old how to code and you're a billionaire by tea time type thing is something that, strikes me. It's the younger, the people that are evolving into this space as youngsters, this is, it's common currency. The narrative is in their world. Yeah. Let's see what they're doing. I'd love to see what the teenagers think about this. They're treating this as sort of just a game, and they're getting involved in it. And my teenager's 21 now, but he feels like a teenager. He comes with, I've got his portfolio of all this stuff. I think, Jesus, when did you get that? Well, my buddies at university have got it. We got this club. We talk about these things. That one looks like it's gone too far. We sell out of that. We buy this, and they're doing it as kind of just this normality. And of course, it's slightly scary. Of course, the core level. It is kind of a bit, finger in the air supervision, finger in the air regulation. And I guess, with the work that Biden's instructed the regulators in the US to do, there may be some form and shape will come into the market. And by the sound of it, it's probably necessary to some extent just to protect people from the fact that it can go seriously wrong pretty quickly. And because bad people are able to get into the system. But I think we're very grateful for the depth of conversation we've had today, and certainly for you taking such time and sharing your views on it. I think we're still overall scratching the surface of this pond, which has still got a very thin layer of ice on that we're looking to maneuver without falling in and getting hypochondria, and that's the end of it. So I think we're almost certainly going to be having you back, and I think it might be worth getting someone like the CME on, some of the people that are at the exchange side, and say, okay, well, what are you guys doing? What do you think about this? What are your challenges, and what's the negative game changer that's coming along that we should be aware of, and what's the positive game changer that could actually sort some of these things out and some of these challenges. So I think that's a nice way for summing up. It's still very much work in progress, I think, for the whole industry. But once again, we're very grateful for your time and for bringing this to life for us. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. We do hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, we would be delighted if you could leave a nice rating and a friendly review on whichever podcast service you use. Also, be sure to subscribe so as not to miss future episodes. Thank you to our podcast sponsor, the Society of Technical Analysts. As a reminder, you can check out how to obtain a discount on their outstanding technical analysis home study course at our website, alpha-mind.net. The AlphaMind podcast is co-hosted by me, Stephen Goldstein, and Mark Randell, and brought to you by the AlphaMind Project Limited. You can learn more about us and the trader performance coaching and executive coaching and leadership coaching programs and services we offer, and other performance development services which we offer to professional trading businesses and individuals in the professional and retail trading space at our website alpha-mind.net. We hope you enjoyed this week. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, do go back through our back catalogue and check out the many wonderful interviews we have with wonderful people from the financial markets. Thank you and best of luck going forward.